Most people think they lack discipline. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that they've been taught to control themselves, and they call it discipline. So they tighten their routines. They force consistency. They suppress every urge that doesn't fit the plan. And for a while, it works. Until it doesn't. Because what feels like strength in the beginning slowly turns into tension. And what they call discipline starts to feel like pressure. Like something they have to constantly hold together. And eventually, it slips. Not because they're weak, but because they were never building discipline to begin with. They were building control. An ancient understanding made a very clear distinction between the two. One creates order. The other creates conflict. And if you don't know the difference, you'll spend years fighting yourself, thinking that's what growth is supposed to feel like. You don't notice the difference at first. Because on the surface, discipline and control look almost identical. Both wake you up early. Both push you to work. Both keep you away from distractions. From the outside, they produce the same behavior. But internally, they come from completely different places. Control is force. It's the part of you that says, "I don't care how you feel. Just do it." It overrides resistance. It suppresses distraction. It shuts down anything that doesn't align with the goal. And in a world that glorifies productivity, that looks like strength. But look closer. Because every time you force yourself, there's another part of you being ignored, silenced, pushed down. And that doesn't disappear. It waits. That's why the same person who is disciplined for 10 days suddenly collapses on the 11th. Not gradually, but completely. Because control doesn't resolve conflict. It builds it. Slowly. Quietly. Under the surface. Until the pressure becomes too much. And when it breaks, it doesn't ask for permission. This is the cycle most people are trapped in. They push hard. They stay strict. They hold everything together through sheer effort. Then they crash. And when they crash, they don't question the method. They question themselves. They say things like, "I need more discipline. I need to try harder. I need to be stronger." But what they're really saying is, "I need more control." And that's where the problem deepens. Because the more control you apply, the more resistance you create. And the more resistance you create, the harder you have to push. Until your entire life becomes a constant act of holding yourself together. No ease. No stability. Just pressure. This is why ancient understanding never started with behavior. It started with something deeper. Not what you do, but what inside you is doing it. Because two people can follow the exact same routine and live completely different internal realities. One is forcing himself through every step. The other is moving with clarity. Same actions. Different state. And that difference is everything. When ancient traditions spoke about discipline, they weren't talking about rigid routines. They weren't obsessed with optimization or squeezing productivity out of every hour. What they were concerned with was order. But not external order. Internal order. A state where your thoughts, your actions, and your direction are not in conflict with each other. Because to them, the real problem wasn't laziness. It was division within the self. One part of you wants to move forward. Another part resists. Another escapes. Another doubts. And most people try to solve that by forcing one part to dominate the others. That's control. But ancient understanding went a different way. Instead of forcing, they focused on alignment. Not suppressing desire, but understanding it. Not silencing distraction, but seeing why it exists. Because when you actually see clearly, something changes. The conflict starts to dissolve on its own. And what remains is a natural movement. This is what discipline originally meant. Not forcing yourself into action, but removing the internal friction that was preventing action in the first place. So instead of pushing yourself every day, you begin to move with less resistance. Less noise. Less negotiation. It becomes quieter. Cleaner. More direct. That's why true discipline doesn't feel heavy. It doesn't feel like something you have to constantly maintain. Because it's not built on pressure. It's built on clarity. And clarity doesn't require force. Think about it. When you're truly clear about something, you don't need motivation. You don't need to argue with yourself. You don't need to stay disciplined. You just act. Not because you're pushing yourself, but because there's nothing inside you pulling the other way. That's internal order. And that's what ancient men were after. Not control over behavior, but understanding of the self. Because once you understand the mechanism, you don't have to fight it anymore. And this is where most people get it wrong today. They skip understanding and go straight to enforcement. They build strict systems. They create rules. They try to dominate their own impulses. But they never stop to ask, why is the impulse there in the first place? What is actually causing the resistance? What part of me is out of alignment? Without that, you're not building discipline. You're just managing chaos. And management is not the same as resolution. It's temporary, fragile, and exhausting. Real discipline is different. It doesn't come from tightening your grip. It comes from removing what's in the way. And once you see that clearly, you start to realize discipline isn't something you force into your life. It's something that naturally appears when conflict is no longer there. Control always feels powerful in the beginning. It gives you a sense of direction, a sense of authority over yourself. You set rules. You create structure. You decide who you're going to be, and then you force yourself to act accordingly. On the surface, that looks like mastery. But control is not mastery. Control is pressure. It's what happens when one part of you tries to dominate the rest. And that domination always comes with tension. Because underneath every act of control, there is resistance. Something in you doesn't agree. Something in you wants something else. And instead of understanding it, you override it. You say, not now. Not allowed. Not part of the plan. So you push it down. And for a moment, it works. You stay focused. You stay on track. You feel in control. But what you don't see is what's happening beneath that surface. Because suppressed impulses don't disappear. They accumulate. Every ignored feeling, every resisted urge, every silenced thought adds pressure. And control depends on your ability to keep that pressure contained. That's why it requires constant effort, constant monitoring, constant correction. You can't relax. Because the moment you do, everything you've been holding down starts pushing back up. That's the hidden cost. Control turns your life into maintenance. You're always managing yourself, watching yourself, correcting yourself. There's no real stability. Just temporary order, held together by effort. And the more intense the control, the more intense the rebound. That's why people swing between extremes. Strict for a while, then completely off track. Focused, then distracted beyond control. Disciplined, then indulgent. It's not random. It's the natural consequence of suppression. Because whatever you push down doesn't weaken. It waits. And when it comes back stronger. Not because it grew, but because it was never understood. This is what control does. It creates a split inside you. One side trying to move forward, the other side being dragged along. And the longer that split exists, the harder everything becomes. Simple actions feel heavy. Small decisions feel draining. Because every step requires force. This is why control cannot last. Not because you're incapable, but because the system itself is unstable. It's built on resistance. And anything built on resistance eventually collapses. Not all at once, but in cycles. Push, hold, slip, repeat. And if you don't see what's actually happening, you'll think the solution is to push harder, to control more, to tighten everything again. Without realizing, that's the very thing keeping you stuck. If control is so unstable, why does it feel like it works? Why does it look so similar to discipline, especially in the beginning? Because control produces results. Immediate ones. You wake up early. You stick to the plan. You avoid distractions. You become consistent, for a period of time. And in a world that measures everything externally, that's enough to convince you. You look at your behavior and think, this is discipline. But behavior alone is misleading. Because it doesn't show you what it costs to maintain it. Control works by narrowing your focus. It shuts everything else out. No negotiation. No hesitation. No distraction allowed. And that intensity creates momentum. You feel sharp, locked in, almost unstoppable. But that state is not natural. It's compressed, held together by effort. That's why it feels so powerful, because it's concentrated force. But anything that relies on force has a limit. And the limit is not your potential. It's your capacity to sustain pressure. Think about it. When you're in that controlled state, you're not relaxed. You're alert, tense, constantly correcting yourself. Even when you're doing well, there's a subtle strain underneath it. Like something you have to keep in place. That strain is the signal. But most people ignore it because the results look good. So they double down. They tighten the structure, add more rules, increase the pressure, trying to extend the phase where things work. But the more they rely on control, the more fragile the system becomes. Because it's not built on stability. It's built on restriction. And restriction always creates buildup. That's why the collapse feels confusing. One day you're locked in, focused, consistent. The next, you can't even follow the simplest plan. And it feels like you lost something. Like discipline just disappeared. But nothing disappeared. What you were using was never stable to begin with. It was temporary enforcement. And enforcement can only last as long as the enforcer is active. The moment your energy drops, your focus slips, or your emotions shift, the system weakens. And everything you were holding together starts to fall apart. This is the illusion. Control mimics discipline. Just long enough to convince you. It gives you results, but not roots. So when it fades, there's nothing underneath to sustain you. No internal order. No alignment. Just the absence of pressure. And in that absence, everything you were suppressing comes back to the surface. Which is why people don't just slow down, they swing. From strict control to complete release. Over and over again. Not realizing they were never practicing discipline. They were practicing control and mistaking the results for something deeper. At first, control feels like progress. You're doing what you said you would do. You're staying on track. You're holding yourself to a higher standard. But over time, something starts to shift. Not externally, internally. You begin to feel it in small ways. A constant tightness. A subtle resistance to your own routine. A quiet exhaustion that doesn't come from the work, but from managing yourself. Because control doesn't just demand action. It demands suppression. And suppression is not free. Every time you ignore how you feel, every time you force yourself through resistance, every time you silence a part of yourself, you create friction. And that friction builds. Slowly. Quietly. Until even simple things start to feel heavy. You wake up, and it's not that you can't act, it's that you don't want to. Not because you're lazy, but because you've been overriding yourself for too long. This is where people start to turn on themselves. They notice the resistance and interpret it as weakness. So they respond the only way they know how, with more control, more pressure, more rules, more force. But that only deepens the problem. Because now it's not just internal conflict, it's internal opposition. One part of you pushing harder, another part pushing back. And the more this continues, the more fragmented you become. You're no longer moving as one. You're divided. And that division shows up everywhere. In your work, where focus feels forced. In your habits, where consistency feels fragile. Even in your rest, where you can't fully relax without guilt. Because control doesn't turn off. It lingers. Always watching. Always correcting. Even when nothing is wrong. This is the hidden cost. You lose the sense of ease. Not comfort, but natural movement. Things that should be simple start to require effort. Not because they're difficult, but because you're carrying resistance into everything. And eventually, it catches up to you. Not as a dramatic breakdown, but as quiet burnout. You still function. You still show up. But something is off. The clarity is gone. The sharpness fades. The drive becomes inconsistent. And you can't explain why. Because on paper, you're doing everything right. But internally, you're exhausted from holding yourself together. This is what control does over time. It doesn't just fail. It drains. It disconnects you from yourself. And when that disconnection grows, discipline becomes harder and harder to access. Not because you lost it, but because you never built it. You built a system of pressure, and now that pressure is wearing you down. The shift doesn't start with doing more. It starts with seeing clearly. Because as long as you believe control is discipline, you'll keep trying to fix the problem with the very thing causing it. More structure, more force, more pressure. And every time it fails, you'll think you're the one failing. So the first shift is simple, but not easy. You stop trying to control yourself. Not by becoming careless, not by letting everything go, but by paying attention. For the first time, you actually look at what's happening inside you. Not to judge it, not to fix it immediately, but to understand it. Because every point of resistance is information. It's showing you something. A conflict, a contradiction, a lack of clarity. And instead of overriding it, you stay with it. You observe it. You ask, why is this here? What is actually pulling me in the opposite direction? Because when you see the cause, the resistance begins to change. Not through force, but through understanding. This is where discipline starts to take a different form. It's no longer about making yourself act. It's about removing what's preventing action. So instead of pushing harder, you simplify. You remove unnecessary pressure. You question rigid rules. You stop building systems that require constant force to maintain. And something subtle begins to happen. The tension decreases. The internal noise quiets down. You're no longer arguing with yourself every step of the way. And in that quiet, action becomes easier. Not effortless, but natural. You still move. You still work. You still follow through. But now it's coming from a different place. Not pressure, but clarity. And clarity is stable. It doesn't depend on mood. It doesn't collapse under stress. It doesn't require constant reinforcement. Because it's not something you're holding together. It's something you see. And once you see it clearly, you don't have to keep convincing yourself. This is the difference. Control needs maintenance. Discipline doesn't. Control is something you do to yourself. Discipline is how you function when there is no internal conflict. That's why it feels lighter, quieter, more consistent. Not because you've become stricter, but because you've removed the friction that made everything feel heavy in the first place. And this is the part most people miss. They think discipline is about adding more habits, more rules, more effort. But real discipline is often subtraction, removing confusion, removing contradiction, removing the need to fight yourself, until what remains is simple, direct, and sustainable. When control drops, it doesn't feel dramatic. There's no sudden surge of motivation, no intense feeling of transformation. It's quieter than that, more subtle. But the difference is undeniable. The first thing you notice is space. Space between impulse and action. Space between thought and reaction. Before, everything was tight, compressed. You were constantly managing yourself, deciding what to allow, what to block, what to force. Now, there's less interference. You see things as they are, without immediately trying to control them. And in that space, your actions begin to change. Not because you're forcing them to, but because you're no longer divided. You don't have to drag yourself into work. You don't have to negotiate with distraction. You see what matters, and you move directly. This is where consistency starts to feel different. Before, consistency meant effort, holding the line, staying strict, pushing through resistance. Now, consistency becomes a byproduct. Not of pressure, but of clarity. You act because it makes sense. Because there's no confusion pulling you away. And when there's no confusion, there's no need to fight. That's the real shift. Discipline without conflict. It doesn't mean everything becomes easy. There are still moments of difficulty. Still moments of uncertainty. But those moments are clean. They're not layered with internal resistance. So instead of draining you, they pass. And you continue. Steady. This is what ancient understanding pointed to. Not a life of control, but a life of order. Where your actions are not forced, but aligned. Where your movement is not driven by pressure, but by clarity. And when you live like this, something else changes. You stop measuring yourself the same way. You're no longer asking, am I disciplined enough? Am I doing enough? Am I staying on track? Because those questions come from doubt, from division. Instead, there's a quiet certainty. Not confidence in the loud sense, but a grounded awareness of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that removes the need to constantly evaluate yourself. You just act. Adjust when necessary. And keep moving. No extremes. No cycles. No collapse. Just continuity. And this is where real strength comes in. Not in how hard you can push yourself, but in how little you need to. Because when there is no internal conflict, there is nothing to overcome. And when there is nothing to overcome, discipline is no longer something you practice. It becomes something you are. If this made you look at your own approach differently, take a moment. Not to plan. Not to fix anything immediately. But to notice where in your life you've been using control and calling it discipline. Because that distinction is where everything starts to change.